Hey guys, John Loehle here. I hope you're having a great day and a productive end to your work week. Welcome to 5-Minute Fridays, where I try to cover something I think is interesting or useful, focused on things photo and video, and answer questions and suggested ideas along the way. Today we're going back to the basics, specifically how to get a proper exposure with shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. At the core of quality photos and videos is a properly exposed image. But what do I mean by that? I mean avoiding blurry photos, underexposed photos, or overexposed photos. An underexposed photo is when there's too little light hitting the camera's sensor and therefore not all the photograph is showing up, especially the darkest parts. This is called crushing the blacks. On the opposite end, overexposed photos is when the brightest sections of a composition are blown out or aren't visible. They just come out as pure white. This applies to both photos and videos. If you think about it, videos are essentially just a stream of photos put at different frame rates. So how do photographers and cinematographers end up getting a properly exposed image? They end up using the exposure triangle, which is a balancing act between shutter speed, ISO, and aperture. The first point to the triangle is the shutter speed. The shutter speed can be basically thought about as the blinking eye. The faster it blinks, the less light is let in, or for a camera, the less light is let into the image sensor. This is also how quickly a camera captures a composition. A faster shutter speed captures things like sports, while a slower shutter speed is often good with astrophotography or landscape photographs. In video and traditional cinema, shutter speed is set at 1/2 times your frame rate. A 30 frame per second video should be shot at 1/60th of a second shutter speed. Likewise, the shutter speed for a 120 frame per second video should be 1/240th. In film school, this is called the 180-degree shutter rule. The 180 degrees goes back to original cinema film, but the principle carries over today to be able to get smooth video that the eye is used to seeing. Traditional movies you're used to seeing in the US are shot at 24 frames a second, so therefore the shutter speed should be 1/48th of a second. The second aspect is called ISO. It's essentially a standardized measurement of the amount of light sensitivity on the image sensor when exposed. A higher ISO produces a brighter image. However, with that brighter image also introduces what's called noise, or back in the film days, film grain. It's always a balancing act, and the ideal situation is to have as much lighting as possible so your ISO remains low. In general, I'm shooting this video at 200 ISO, and in landscape photographs, I try to stick to 100 ISO at all times, sometimes at night shots getting up to 500 ISO, but beyond that, I start to see noticeable unwanted grain or noise in the picture. The third aspect of the exposure triangle is aperture, sometimes seen as the most complicated of the three aspects. You can think of it as the pupil. It's essentially the amount of light that's let into the back element of your lens and into the sensor. The larger the aperture, the more light is let in. The smaller the aperture, the less light is let in. Aperture is measured in f-stops. A large f-stop number like f16 is actually a very small aperture, while a small number like f1.4 is actually a very large aperture. So why not just leave your lens wide open all the time? Well, it introduces something called depth of field. Depth of field is the distance between the nearest and furthest object that is in focus. A larger aperture has a shallower depth of field, while a smaller aperture has a much longer depth of field. The larger the aperture, the shallower the depth of field. This is useful in portrait photography when you want to blow out the background with a nice bokeh. A small aperture is used a lot in landscape photography, where you want to have a foreground object in focus and have it in focus all the way out to a mountain range. To summarize, with photos you want a fast enough shutter speed to capture motion, you want an ISO low enough to give you a quality image, and you want to have your aperture wherever it needs to be to give you that artistic feel that you're going for. For video, it's usually recommended that you follow the 180-degree rule restricting your shutter speed. Therefore, you need to balance your ISO and aperture to do whatever you're wanting to do artistically. So that's all I have for you today. Join me as I continue to build content on this channel. Please like the video if you learned something new. Put future ideas that interest you down in the comments section below. Subscribe, and I'll see you soon.